All right, let's dive into a period that completely reshaped our world. Between 1750 and 1900, the global map was redrawn on a scale that is just staggering. This was an era where nations exploded in power, building these vast, globe-spanning empires. So you gotta ask, how did they do it? What was their playbook? A good way to picture it is like a massive global game of Risk. But this wasn't a board game. We're talking about real nations, real territory, and real influence, with consequences that completely shifted the balance of power on the planet. So today, we're going to unpack that playbook, the key strategies these nations used to build their empires. For a long time, the imperial game was mostly focused on the Americas. But in this period, whoa, the lens just dramatically shifts over to Africa and Southeast Asia. And the players in the game were changing too. You had the old powers like Spain and Portugal kind of fading, while these new, hungry forces like Germany, Belgium, the United States, and Japan jumped onto the scene in a big way. So how'd they pull it off? Okay, our first method is a really fascinating one. It's this transition from private, profit-hungry companies running colonies to the government stepping in and taking direct control. This wasn't always the original plan, but it became a pattern that just kept repeating itself. And you can see this pattern pretty clearly. Step 1, a private company gets a charter to run a territory, and their only goal is profit. Step 2, this almost always leads to a major crisis. We're talking horrific brutality, out-of-control corruption, or the company just going flat out broke. And that leads to Step 3. Things get so bad that the home government has no choice but to step in, dissolve the company, and take over. The Belgian Congo is probably the most disturbing example of this. King Leopold II of Belgium basically said, you know what? The Congo is mine. He ran it as his personal property, totally separate from the actual Belgian government. He sold it to the world as this great civilizing mission. But behind the scenes, it was nothing but brutal exploitation, first for ivory and then for rubber, which was becoming incredibly valuable. The human cost it's almost impossible to comprehend. We are talking about millions of people dying from forced labor, systemic violence, and cruelty that is just unimaginable. Eventually, the stories of these atrocities got out, and the international outcry was so loud that the Belgian government was finally forced to take control in 1908. And the thing is, the Congo wasn't a one-off. Not at all. We saw this exact same story play out in the Dutch East Indies. The powerful Dutch East India Company, the VOC, became so corrupt it went bankrupt, forcing the Dutch government to step in. Same thing in India. After the massive Indian Rebellion of 1857 made it crystal clear that the British East India Company couldn't handle it anymore, which led directly to the British government taking over and establishing the Raj. All right, the next method in the playbook uses a couple of tools that seem like total opposites, but were really two sides of the same imperial coin: diplomacy and, well, warfare. So on one hand, you've got diplomacy, talking it out, making deals. On the other, you've got warfare, just straight up military conquest. But when you're trying to build an empire, these two were often woven together, used strategically to get the exact same thing: more land and more power. The Berlin Conference is maybe the most infamous example of so-called diplomacy being used as a tool of empire. So the German Chancellor, Bismarck, was getting worried that this mad scramble for Africa might cause a war between the European powers. So he calls everyone to Berlin to carve things up nicely. And that's literally what they did. They drew lines on a map and divided up almost the entire continent. The most appalling part of it all, not a single African leader was even in the room. And then on the warfare side, you get stories that sound like they have to be made up. Back in 1830, France was itching for an excuse to invade Algeria. And the one they landed on was an incident where the Algerian ruler, in the middle of a heated argument about a debt, apparently hit the French diplomat with his fly swatter. France declared this a massive insult to their national honor and used that, a fly swatter, as the reason to launch a full-scale, incredibly brutal invasion. Now, this third method was a whole different ballgame. This wasn't just about ruling a place from thousands of miles away. No. This was about physically moving huge numbers of your own people to create what some historians call neo-Europes in brand new territories. So what we're talking about here is a settler colony. This is a place where the imperial power doesn't just send soldiers and administrators, it actively encourages its own citizens to pack up, move, and live there for good. The goal here wasn't just to extract resources. It was to completely remake the place, demographically and culturally, into a mirror image of the mother country. But creating these new societies came at an absolutely devastating price for the people who were already living there. In places like Australia and New Zealand, the arrival of British settlers brought new diseases that the Aboriginal and Maori populations had zero immunity to, leading to just catastrophic drops in their populations. And that's on top of losing their land and having their entire way of life upended. It's a brutal part of this story. Our final method is maybe the most direct one you can imagine, just expanding into the land right next to you. Instead of sailing across oceans, these empires just looked next door and decided to grow. In the United States, this was all driven by this powerful idea called manifest destiny. This was this widespread belief that it was the God-given right, the divine mission of the U.S. to expand and control the entire continent, all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It wasn't just a policy, it was a core part of the culture that fueled this relentless push west. Of course, this expansion came at a terrible, terrible cost to Native American populations. As settlers moved west, tribe after tribe was systematically and often violently forced off their ancestral lands. They were pushed onto reservations and subjected to official government policies of forced assimilation, policies designed to literally erase their languages and their cultures. And the U.S. wasn't alone in this. After Russia lost the Crimean War, it turned its ambitions eastward. It was driven by this idea of pan-Slavism, uniting all Slavic peoples, and ended up conquering huge parts of Central Asia. And at the same time, a modernizing Japan was building its own empire by taking territory right from its neighbors in Korea and Manchuria, showing that this imperial playbook wasn't just a Western thing. So we've gone through all these different methods. We have to step back and ask, what does it all add up to? What are the long-term consequences of this insane period of global expansion? We've seen this whole toolkit for empire building, right? You have the company-to-crown takeovers, the 1-2 punch of diplomacy and war, the creation of settler societies, and just straight-up conquering your neighbors. Each strategy was a little different, but they all pointed to the same goal. And in the end, these strategies did way more than just redraw some lines on a map. They completely transformed societies around the world. They created these deep, complicated legacies of colonialism that continue to shape global politics, economies, and even our cultural identities, right up to this very day. And that really leaves us with one last big question to think about. When you look at the world today, at international relations, at the distribution of wealth, at modern conflicts, how many of those patterns of power and inequality are really just echoes of the world that was built during this period? It's a question that shows just how much this history still matters.